Hey everybody, this is Unit 3, Lecture 5. It's all about hearing. It is also referred to as audition or your auditory ability or your auditory sense. We do not have too many learning targets, but of course there's a lot packed in there. I do think it's easier to understand than the eye, so we got that going for us. If you happen to have 3 colors available to you, you might want to use them because the ear is divided into 3 parts. And each of these 3 sections have 3 parts of their own. So let's get started with the outer ear. The outer ear is made up of the pinna, auditory canal, and the eardrum, scientifically known as the tympanic membrane. You'll want to note that the pinna is the part that actually collects the sound. Like it kind of takes all these sound waves and it brings it into the ear. The middle ear is made up of 3 ossicles. Ossicles are the 3 types of little bones that vibrate in relation to the vibrations that hit the eardrum to create a neural signal. So we've got the hammer, anvil, and stirrup. There are other scientific names, but for our purposes, these names will suffice. The inner ear is made up of the auditory nerve, the basilar membrane, and the cochlea. We are going to talk a lot about the cochlea because that is actually where the transduction will occur. The auditory nerve itself comes off the back of the cochlea and then travels to the brain. So we'll get more into that in a little bit, but in case you missed any, oh wait, I forgot, there's one more thing. This structure is the semicircular canals. These are not used for hearing, they are used for balance. So it's important to note on the diagram, but we'll talk about that, I believe in the next lecture when we talk about the body's sense of balance. In case you missed anything, here are all of the parts one more time. As promised, we're going to go a little bit more in depth into the cochlea. The cochlea is a coiled, bony, fluid-filled tube in the inner ear. This is where transduction occurs. And remember, transduction is churning a stimulus into a nerve impulse, or in this case, it changes the sound waves into neural auditory signals. This specifically happens because of cilia, so follicle or little hair-like receptor cells that are in these tubes that bend or move in relation to vibrations. So the slightest movement will trigger a response, and then the louder the sound, the more that these hairs will bend. Sometimes you might even accrue hearing loss if they bend and potentially don't bounce back, or bend and actually break. We'll do more on that in a little bit. Just like light is transmitted with wavelengths in vision, sound is transmitted with wavelengths in hearing. We determine the pitch of that sound through the frequency. And frequency, if you remember from our vision lecture, is based on the wavelength or how many waves occur in a given distance. So frequency or pitch of a sound is determined by wavelength of sound measured this time in hertz. A high frequency means a high pitched, really squeaky sound. And then just to make the connection, I put this down here. A higher frequency means higher pitch, and higher frequency in vision means blues and purples. So these really tight waves compared to these low waves that produce either red in terms of vision or low sounds in terms of pitch. Humans hear best between 20 and 20, Humans are capable of hearing anywhere from 20 to 20,000 hertz. However, we hear best from 3,000 to 4,000 hertz. We'll talk about this again in class because we'll do a little demonstration to see what you can hear. Intensity, again, just like brightness in vision, is considered loudness in hearing. It is the amount of energy in a wave determined by amplitude. Hopefully you're starting to notice some connections to your vision notes. And this is measured in decibels. Here is the process of how the stimulus goes from the environment all the way into the proper region of your brain. The sound waves start off going in your outer ear. Your auditory, so the pinna collects them and sends it to the auditory canal to your eardrum, which will then start to vibrate. Those vibrations trigger the ossicles to start moving, and they act like pistons, like beating like almost like drumsticks, I guess, against the oval window. That oval window is against the cochlea, which really I'm just realizing should probably be in here. The cochlea is where the vibrations will turn into electric neural impulses. So be sure to add that word right here. And then those neural impulses go into the brain and it visits the thalamus or the sensory switchboard and gets sent to the auditory cortex. Now we're going to move on to two different theories on how we actually hear. So we already know the transduction process. That's what we just hit on the last page, on the last slide. But now we need to talk about how different types of sound reach our brains. The first theory is that of frequency theory. And this is the idea that the rate of nerve impulses along the auditory nerve matches the frequency of a tone, enabling us to sense pitch. This sounds a little bit confusing, I'm sure. It's a mouthful. But basically, if we have a frequency of, let's just say, 100 waves per second, then that's going to create 100 pulses per second along the auditory nerve. So the frequency of the stimulus matches the frequency of the nerve message. And scientists have determined that this explains low sounds in particular. Another theory would be place theory, and this is the idea that sound frequencies stimulate certain locations, in other words, places, hence place theory, on the basilar membrane. So think of it this way. Different types of pitches, it's almost like hitting different keys on a keyboard or a piano. Depending on where that sound hits, it will produce either a high pitch or a low pitch. So, for example, high pitches are large vibrations near the stirrup, which is the beginning of the basilar membrane. I feel like both of these make more sense on my next slide where I have a little bit of a visual. So the frequency theory is again the idea that this, whatever the wave is of the sound you're listening to, in this case my voice, that same wave is going to turn into neural impulse and it's going to continue the same pattern. Place theory has more to do with where the sound hits on the cochlea. So if it hits here, it's likely to be a high-pitched sound. If it hits here, it might be more likely to be a low-pitched sound. So here, a high-pitched, high-frequency wave hits more at the beginning of the cochlea, whereas the low-frequency, low-pitched sounds hit more and deeper into the cochlea. So the nice thing about this is that the name actually gives you a pretty good hint about what it means. We are cruising right along. So we have to learn about 3 different types of hearing loss. And the first one is noise-induced hearing loss. This is the progressive inability to detect higher frequency sounds due to hair cell damage accrued over time and use. This affects all of us. In regular people talk, what this is saying is that over time, as we listen to loud sounds, our hearing will become damaged. Like it or not, it's going to happen to all of us, which is why older people have trouble hearing. Some to the point where they actually need a hearing aid, and some it's not necessarily that bad, but all of us will experience this type of hearing loss. Any sound loud enough to produce tinnitus, or in other words, a ringing in your ear, can cause some damage. Typically, this would be exposure to 85 decibels or more. The higher the intensity of the sound, the more likely you are to actually tear off those cilia, those hairs that transduce hearing sounds into neural waves, and they cannot regenerate. The government has deemed, government research, not the government in terms of policy, but government research suggests that safe exposure is 85 decibels, is up to 85 decibels for 8 hours a day. So in other words, anything beyond that could be damaging, especially for a sustained amount of time. So things like rock concerts, chainsaws, listening to your headphones at peak volumes, jackhammers, things like that. And of course, the loud booms associated with gunshots and fireworks. The reason something like the 4th of July is still safe is because you're not constantly being exposed to these these sounds. Noise-induced hearing damage is related to both duration and volume. So I'm just talking about volume here, but the length of exposure to these sounds also matters in terms of hearing damage. A couple other types of hearing loss. One is conduction deafness. This is damage to the mechanical system that conducts sound waves to the cochlea. In other words, damage to those ossicle bones. This is a type of deafness that can be corrected with surgery or hearing aids. Sensorineural deafness, going with it, is damage to the cochlea's receptor cells or the auditory nerve. So, conductive deafness is anything that occurs in the outer or middle ears or up to the middle ears. Sensorineural is actually only, or is the type of deafness happening in the inner ear, which makes sense because once it's gone through the cochlea, it becomes an actual neural message. So that is that type of deafness. This is nerve deafness. It is a permanent condition, but it can be treated with a cochlear implant. Think about what you now know about the cochlea. By putting in an implant, you can recreate this transduction procedure. A little bit more about a cochlear implant. This is a small, complex electronic device that provides a sense of sound to a person who's profoundly deaf or severely hard of hearing. So there is an actual mechanical piece that is visible. Well, it's pretty well camouflaged, but it is behind the ear. And then I believe it requires a surgical procedure to put a wire into your auditory nerve. So it's wired to send electric impulses into the auditory nerve, and it does not restore normal hearing, but it does give the representation of sound. My understanding is that this is typically done to someone who is completely deaf, and not just someone who has acquired hearing loss over time. So besides a few other demonstrations and some videos that I'm going to save for us to see in class, that wraps it up for our hearing lecture.